next is the roles of women in the War of 1812. Okay, so a little introduction to the War of 1812. So Dr. John Chai gives a lot of information about the European wars in the War of 1812. So the European War started in 1803, and it was between Great Britain and France at the time. So 4 years after the European Wars started, trade and exportations in the United States rose over 500%, and this caused a dilemma of who would trade with the United States for France and Great Britain. So this caused a lot of problems with the trade routes between these two countries. President Madison at the time did not want to make a decision of who to ally with and who to keep trading with, and for this reason the United States kept trade with both the countries at the time, which caused a lot of problems. So we saw the destruction of trade routes overseas, and for that reason cargo and men would be confiscated and stolen off of these ships, as well as the destruction of the ships. And on the US front, just expansionism, it was a problem because the settlers believed we had a right to colonize all the land, and that caused a lot of problems with the natives and us. So we began to believe that Great Britain was funding and supplying Native American attacks against us, and for that reason we declared war on them. So all of these have to do with the contributions of men, and we don't really hear a lot about the roles of the women in the War of 1812. So here are some of the roles of women. So before the War of 1812, women were seen as the backbone of the household, so men would have more traditional jobs, while women would stay in the house, raise the children, take care of the house, and a lot of their social liberties were taken away at the time. So Dr. Jane Randall talks about how women would reclaim their social liberties, and one of them was acting as nurses. So women with larger households or who lived by the coast would often take in injured soldiers. So they would provide rehabilitation treatments, clothing, food, and supplies to these soldiers in need. Another thing that they would do was they would make goods. Since the Age of Passion forced women into arts and crafts, they would use these skills to make things as blankets, quilts, clothing, bags, and tourniquets for the soldiers. And they would be packed up and shipped to the military camps, bases, or to the homes where the women would act as nurses. Also, the women of Ohio and Kentucky were really prominent at this time. The pioneer families of Cleveland was a primary source from 1817, and it talks about how these women would work in churches that had kitchens or the largest households of their towns and stay up all night and day cooking food such as preserved meats, loaves of bread, and tea. So they would send these to the camp so that soldiers would have food. So any local soldiers that was passing through, they could pick up a fresh meal. And all of these things were done out of pocket for these women. The federal government did not fund this, so this is why it's really significant that these women did this for the war. Okay, so all those women before, it was kind of generalized, but these are some examples of specific women that have been written down in history. So the first is Laura Secord of Canada, and a lot of information can be found about her in the Niagara Falls Museum. So Laura and her husband were forced to house American soldiers in their home. And so one night, Laura overheard them talking about a plan to attack a Canadian base. And Laura went on a 2-day trek through the wilderness to inform the lieutenant of that camp. And so with that information, that lieutenant went on to win the Battle of Beaver Dams based on Laura's information. Next is Elizabeth Hopkins of Fredericton. And Elizabeth, her husband was a part of the Marines, and she missed him so much that she enlisted under the false identity of a man to be on that same ship, and she worked in artillery. And so during a battle, her and her husband and the rest of the crew was captured, and they were placed in a military prison. But she managed to escape because she was released for being a woman, and she went back to that camp and helped the rest of the crew escape, and continued to do so with other different camps for the rest of the war. And finally, Margaret Nels, the York Sudbury Historical Society, gives information about her because she was a wealthier woman, but she also didn't work directly on the front lines. So like I said, she was a wealthy woman and hosted a lot of parties where if generals were passing through, they would come to her house and soldiers, and she would learn information about the war. So different plans she did over here. If a town needed extra reinforcement or they needed to evacuate, her and her women would tell these towns, and they would do that before the soldiers would get there. So overall, the roles of women in the War of 1812 was really significant because although making a loaf of bread or making a quilt or acting as a nurse might not seem huge in the time of war, it's all the little things that really impact war efforts. You can't have a war without soldiers being fed, clothed, or sheltered, so that's why the roles of women was significant.